Nomad Nation, welcome to our very first webinar. I am William Jackson, aka the Nomadic Professor, and if you've taken any of my courses, you know who this guy is.
My name's Nate Norlander. I'm a high school teacher, been teaching in the United States and China for nearly a decade.
We have a lot on the docket tonight. First, we are going to ask a theoretical question. Who would win if a Haitian guerrilla warrior / dictator were pitted up against a Vietnamese emperor, the Uniter of Vietnam, successful against China and Cambodia? Who would win in that scenario? And I'll give you my answer.
Then I'm going to introduce a segment called 2-Minute Tips, in which I introduce or suggest a resource and offer a tip that I or my students have found valuable in the classroom.
We'll follow that up with some mini lecture previews, the mini lectures that I plan to publish over the next 4 weeks, and I'll give you the chance to try and guess where they were shot before I provide that answer.
The next segment I'll introduce is called Common Errors, in which I will introduce and cover an error that I have seen my students make many times that I think is easily avoidable, usually, and I'll make some suggestions for how to do that.
Then we'll follow that up with the headliner of the night. That is the lecture. The topic will be the Hellenistic Age. This is a lecture that I gave. It was filmed at the University of Utah about a year ago, and I hope you enjoy it. Very interesting time. And if you stick around to the end, that's when I will reveal the locations of the next 4 mini lectures. So hang tight. All right, on to who would win. On Instagram, it looks like Quang Trung was victorious, although barely. Let me tell you where I stand on this theoretical. Toussaint Louverture, and I apologize to all French people, I don't speak French, obviously. Toussaint Louverture was a skilled guerrilla fighter who, in the midst of the Haitian slave revolt, the revolt in Saint-Domingue, French-controlled, he's able to organize his own guerrilla army, and he's very successful. He will end up fighting for Spain. He'll end up fighting for the British. He'll switch back to the French once the French have abolished slavery. They're going through their own revolution, of course. And then he'll sort of become the dictator of the whole island. He'll have to defeat the Spanish in the process. So, pretty imposing. Quite the record of success, military success. He could be very brutal. He rid the country of his own political rivals very brutally and bloodily. Both foreign and domestic. But he did surrender to a 20,000-man Bonapartist army and then died while under arrest. So that's Toussaint Louverture. Then there's Quang Trung. And I apologize to all you Vietnamese speakers. I do not speak Vietnamese. But Quang Trung was able to, with his brothers, foment rebellion in what we call Southern Vietnam, and eventually bring that power structure down, impose his will there, extend it into central Vietnam, and then, though it took the better part of a decade, extend that control into northern Vietnam, thereby uniting the country, to use that euphemism, uniting, really conquering and plundering brutally. Uniting Vietnam. In the process, he took down family rivals, he took down a Siamese army, he took down the Imperial Lê army, in fact, that whole dynasty, essentially. He took down a Cambodian army, and he took down 2 Chinese armies. These are armies of the Qing dynasty, that most powerful of Chinese dynasties, greatest territorial extent ever, and he's fighting them at the time of the Qing dynasty's most powerful emperor, the Qianlong emperor. And Quang Trung is victorious. So, quite a list of victories and triumphs and accomplishments, at least from a military point of view. And he's clever. He's able to consistently sort of make his enemies complacent, make his enemies believe that he's been weakened or led into a trap before he destroys them. And he might have even conquered southern China as well, but he died of illness before the invasion could get underway. So Quang Trung commanded far more men. He conquered far more territory. He stood up to China at the height of its power, the height of Qing power under its most powerful emperor. And he might have seriously threatened the seemingly invincible Qing at home had he not died of illness. I don't think it would have even been close. Quang Trung would win. So what do you think, Nate? Was I correct?
I'm going to disagree. I think the Haitian revolutionary is going to take this one, probably because of access to superior European weapons technologies.
He's totally wrong, but let's go on to
2-minute tip.
2-minute tip. Here we go.
All right, I want to introduce a website I've started to rely on that saves me a lot of time getting to the bottom of any given news story, and I think helps me do so more reliably than I was doing on my own. It's called Ground News. So if you go to ground.news, it'll bring you to the homepage, which is like a newspaper featuring all the headlines for the day. So first, when you click on an article, you'll come to that article's homepage. At the top of the page, you see this coverage analysis. This is a synopsis of who has covered the story across the nation and what their political leanings are according to Ground News. And I'm going to set aside, for the sake of this recommendation, the question of how reliable is their judgment about the political bias of any given outlet. Whether we would quibble with one assignment or another, I think this gives us a really useful, at least first impression about any given story. You can see with this story, it was pretty popular. 43 different sources covered the story, but 67% of them were on the right. So I can infer a lot from that about who considers this to be newsworthy information or how politically useful it is to one side or the other. A story getting imbalanced coverage like this, at the very least, should raise questions about the motivations for why one source or another has published it or not published it or covered it in a certain way. Second thing to note on this homepage is the article titles. This is extremely useful, even more than trusting the judgment of Ground News about the political bias of a source. This is direct evidence of that bias. So let's just compare two of the titles that reveal a lot about the way these outlets are framing the story. Let's start with CNN. CNN's title is Unconscionable. Lawmaker Cynthia Johnson reacts to racist voicemails. All right, so in this title, lawmaker Cynthia Johnson is a victim of racism. I'm not making any judgments about Cynthia Johnson or whether or not the event in question was racist. Okay, so we're just sticking strictly to the headlines. If all I read is this headline, because CNN is my preferred news outlet, my impression is going to be very different than if I read another headline. So let's find another one. All right, so I'm just going to pick the low-hanging fruit here. If we look at Fox News, the title conveys a very different impression. Michigan State Representative threatens Trumpers, calls on soldiers to make them pay. So, according to the headline from Fox News, the representative is the aggressor here. She is threatening. She is condescending to Trumpers. She's calling on soldiers to make these people pay. This headline might make readers or Trump supporters afraid, like Congress is calling on a citizen army to foment violence or something. It's not even close to the way CNN framed it. And you can look through the headlines. I haven't even chosen the most extreme ones. You've got a writer for CNN and a writer for Fox both sitting down thinking of inflammatory ways to frame this narrative. It just seems irresponsible and unfair. It doesn't seem like either of these outlets are telling us what happened. They are very interested in framing what happened according to an obvious political bias. And it can be really useful to see all of this on one page. It can help us get out of the habit of relying on one or two sources, because we can see so clearly how poorly just one or two sources will do at keeping us fully informed and fairly informed. All right, so there's a lot more to this site. I said I would go through multiple examples. I've run out of time with just one. I strongly recommend this site. Not affiliated with them. I get nothing from promoting them. Just think it's a very valuable service that they offer and a good place to go to get your news.
All right, we got some hopefully interesting locations. Here's number one. Where am I? Can you tell? Little ocean back there. Number 2, some big clues in the background here, particularly right there, although they have several installations. Here we are. I've shot quite a few videos in this country. Where am I specifically? And finally, here I am in front of this imposing looking structure. Can you tell where I am? That one's a little more difficult. All right, we will reveal where I am at the end. Stick with us. All right, of those 4 clips, Nate, how many do you think you know?
I know at least 2, maybe 3.
All right, well, stick around to the end of the lecture, and we'll find out if he's right, if you're right, and we'll reveal those locations. But first, what's next?
We're going to move on to the common error segment, and this will be our first one. So I'm going to number them. This is common error number 1. Okay, I'm going to talk about a common error, one that I see all the time in my high school classrooms. And it has to do with judging the reliability or credibility of a website based on information that is far too shallow or just outdated. For example, the first thing that many students turn to when they are trying to defend their use of a particular source is the top-level domain. It ends in .com or it ends in .edu or .org, and therefore it's reliable. Now, just to show that this experience is not exclusive to my classroom or just to high school students, I want to show a few examples that I pulled from current university websites about how to judge the reliability of an online source. This first one it comes from a method called the CRAAP method, C-R-A-A-P. One of those A's is authority. So what the university recommends is that the students check whether the URL reveals anything about the source. The examples they give are, is it a .com, a .edu, a .gov, a .org, or a .net? The second example from another university from a different method called the STAR method, S-T-A-A-R. And they make a similar recommendation under authority, where they ask the students, what does the domain name reveal about the source of the information? For example, .com, .edu, .gov. So we see the same recommendation again. The problem with this is that if it was once true, it no longer is. There are no restrictions that I know of on registering a .com, a .org, a .net top-level domain name. Any organization can get these top-level domains. So it can't be used as a reliable indicator of a website's credibility. Even .edu, any user under that institution's domain name is going to be able to publish with the .edu top-level domain. So you don't know if the paper you're looking at is from an undergraduate student or a peer-reviewed paper from a reputable research institution. And that's a distinction that really matters, but that I have seen students be tricked by many, many times. All right, next common recommendation for judging a website's credibility or reliability has to do with sort of its surface presentation. Does it look professional? So under accuracy, we read, is the web page complete, or is it missing information or pages? Are there spelling, grammar, or other typos? One more example from yet another university. Under sophistication, they ask, is the site well written and organized, or the source? Does it enable you, the reader, to learn something from it? So it's asking students to make judgments based on aesthetics and sort of these surface indicators of professionalism and competence, which, while not wrong necessarily, is far from enough. And if this is part of the rubric we use to judge websites, it should only be one item out of several, because it's very easy for bad actors with a good education to make a website that looks just as credible as good actors. So I've gone into more depth on judging the credibility and reliability of sources in the document lessons throughout nomadic courses. So you can look at those lessons for models of ways that I try to work through source information. What I want to do now is just introduce two groups that are doing work explicitly devoted to these questions of online reading. While I'm coming at it from the perspective of a secondary history teacher, These groups are explicitly devoted to educating consumers of online information in how to consume that information and not be taken in by bad actors, misinformation, disinformation, etc. The first group that I've been using for a long time is from Stanford, and it's called Civic Online Reasoning. Their website is cor.stanford.edu. It brings you to this page, Civic Online Reasoning. That is their stated mission, to improve our ability to reason online in order to be better members of society, in order to be more capable of being civically engaged in responsible ways. So I'm going to go to View Curriculum Collections, and all I'm going to do is just recommend a couple of topics rather than go into them in depth right now. But if you scroll through the site, you can get a sense for who they are, what their lessons are about, what they're trying to accomplish. I introduced lateral reading in US 1, document lesson 4.5. It's the skill of going outside of the website you're looking at to see what other websites say about it, rather than judging the website from its internal content alone. It's a skill that fact checkers use that I think is a necessary skill. Here is the lesson on domain names and whether or not it is valid to use the domain name as a criteria for judging credibility. They have collections so that you could go through these lessons more systematically if you're doing it as a teacher in a brick and mortar school or in a homeschool setting, or you're just a person interested in reading better online. I highly recommend checking out the resources here that are relevant to your experience. The second group that I will recommend is a YouTube channel called Control F, and they have a similar mission of encouraging responsible and informed online reading. They teach how to use Wikipedia in the right ways. What are acceptable ways to use Wikipedia? Is it always a laughable Michael Scott type error to rely on Wikipedia, or are there ways in which it's useful? This website covers that in ways that I find to be very convincing and credible. Here's a short series of videos, Online Verification Skills with Mike Caulfield. 4 videos that I've used in my classroom as a series that go through 4 discrete skills and steps that in a matter of 15 minutes can educate a person in some of the most common mistakes we make in trying to make judgments about online information. So it's another video series that I highly recommend. And that's it for today's common error. I'm not affiliated with Civic Online Reasoning or with the YouTube channel Control F. These are just 2 resources that I use in my classroom and that I still find useful as an adult and reasonably careful consumer of online information. I find these tips and tricks very useful in my own reading. So I highly recommend them as resources.
Yeah, I see that same problem all the time in my classes. My students using the same 2 or 3, frankly, not very reputable domains, but they just happen to turn up first in a Google search.
Which is interesting because I teach 15 to 18-year-olds. He teaches college students, and the exact same mistakes get repeated.
It is the exact same. I mean, really. And it's, for some reason, it's very, very difficult to break them of this habit.
Yeah.
Once they've done it for a few years, I mean, it takes real training.
Yeah.
So those of you who are taking our courses, particularly at a young age, good for you. Stick with it. All right. So next, we're going to move to the lecture portion. This is an hour and 20 minutes. I'm giving you the goods here. This was filmed, again, at the University of Utah. The Hellenistic Age, that is the topic. So we're right after the death of Alexander the Great. You're going to notice for the first 10 minutes or so, there's like a blinking light in the corner. That's not my fault. But it does get resolved about 10 minutes in, so don't let it bother you. And at the end, we'll reveal where those 4 mini lectures were filmed. All right, on to the lecture. We ended last time with sort of the death of Alexander, age 33. He's created the most extensive empire the world's ever seen. That's anywhere in the world. Certainly the most diverse in terms of ethnicities and languages and cultures and histories. But now he's dead, so now what? He seems to have thought long and hard about how he was going to hold this thing together, and he seems to have had long-term plans, but he just didn't have time to bring it to fruition. And so what ends up happening, and again, people always make a big thing about, Alexander, he could conquer a big empire, but he couldn't hold it together. Again, I'm no fan of Alexander from a moral point of view, but it only broke apart into 3 big pieces. It's not like it splintered into 100 different little statelets. So let's talk about how is the map changed when Alexander dies? Well, there are brief and brutal wars. They flame in and out for 50 years before everything's really settled. But essentially, you have 3 major powers coming out of the Alexandrian Empire. The first, the smallest, but important because it's there in Macedon and Greece. That is the state of the Antigonids, the kingdom of the Antigonids. So this is founded by one of Alexander's generals, a one-eyed general. And this dynasty will remain, this is the power in the Greek world, the world of Greece, mainland Greece. It'll eventually be taken over by the Romans in the 160s BC, but for about 150 years, the Antigonids rule where Philip had once ruled, where Alexander had once ruled back in Greece. And we'll notice a pattern with these Alexandrian states. They all centralize. That's important. They're all very statist. They're all very good, very efficient at taxation. I mean, that's the highest form of centralization, of accruing power in the center. That's what that means, centralization. The highest form of centralization is taxation. The ability of that central power to expropriate the surplus of everybody within the domain, within their jurisdiction. If you can't do that, you haven't centralized very well. For the regular Joe, that might be a really good thing. What we'll see is that all these states that come out of the Alexandrian Empire are very good at centralizing. They're very good at expropriating, at taxing. And the Antigonids are no exception. In all of these states, a new urban class will do very well, particularly the class that is located there in the capital, these new capitals. They do very well because all that wealth gets concentrated by force in the centers, in the capitals, in the cities. But the mass bulk of people still live where? They're rural, yeah, right. They live out in the country. And they're farmers. And these guys, despite the fact that they continue to produce a little better and a little better each generation, a little more, much of their surplus is expropriated by the state and then invested in cities and in Antigonid country, in canals, in ships. We look at these states and we can see that there's something glorious about it. These massive fleets, mostly merchant fleets of the Macedonians. The big canals they were able to build, the roads they were able to build, the cities. Goodness, the Hellenistic age, which is what we're going to talk about today. The Hellenistic age. This is the age following the Alexandrian conquests, but before Rome takes it all. The Hellenistic age. 200, 300 years. Very, very awesome when it comes to, a lot of different things, one of which is the building of cities. We see like 300 new cities in the Hellenistic world crop up. Not towns, not villages, real cities with tens of thousands of inhabitants. But it comes at a great cost. The reason that's able to happen is because you have central authorities who've become very good at taxation, expropriating large amounts, most of the surplus, from the farming peasantry, and then pumping it into specific centers. That makes those centers look super prosperous, and anyone connected to them, they can benefit. The merchants benefit, anyone living in the cities benefit, the elite class, they all benefit, but the peasantry that's making it all possible, of course, they're the great losers of the Hellenistic age. There was this political philosophy that was prevalent then that, number one, if you want prosperity, you have to have cities and a thriving merchant class. Okay? And maybe there's something to that. These states will take that and mean, oh, we should tax heavily and invest in those sectors. And the second part of the philosophy was, if you want to avoid revolution, then you keep your farming rural class, the masses, you keep them cripplingly poor. You don't want them to amass too much wealth, because then they'll take on heirs, and pretty soon there'll be a whole party or a movement, and before you know it, rebellion. And so that from a modern economic point of view, that's total nonsense. But that was a prevailing philosophical idea. You keep the peasantry poor through taxation. And the side benefit, which of course is probably the primary benefit, is that then you have all that surplus in your treasury. Your treasury is overflowing. And the history books get to write about your court as this wonderful, amazing, glorious place that produced all this literature and scientific advancements and feats of engineering. And that was made possible by your farmers and the expropriation of all their surplus. So, centralization, that's one of the great hallmarks of these post-Alexandrian states. They're all very centralized, meaning they all have very efficient, pretty brutal taxation systems that focus intensely on farmers and the farming peasants. But as a result, their cities are gleaming. Their cities are pretty impressive, and their capitals, amazing. The world's never seen anything like it. We'll talk about a couple of them. So the Antigonids, they're focusing on canal building and fleets. The Antigonids are actually, all these guys are big on, like I mentioned, trade and the merchant class. That's one of the great beneficiaries of all this redistribution of wealth is the merchant class. All of them are trying to find new trade routes, trading farther and farther, as far as they can. And it's pretty amazing. The Antigonids, for example, traded with Britain regularly. It's not like one expedition got there. They regularly trade with Britain and with Spain. Both of these places are rich in metals. So the Antigonids are trading far and wide. The Seleucids, this is the biggest state geographically by far to come out of the Alexandrian conquests. It stretches all the way from western Anatolia all the way over to India, to the edges of India. Now that vastness doesn't last very long. Starting in 250-ish BC, the whole eastern half begins to break away under a new power. And you will become familiar with these guys. Anyone know who they are? The new version of the Persians. They will become the inheritors of the Persian Empire eventually. And the great nemesis of Rome. The great enemies of Rome. That is going to kill me. I got to turn that off. That's too dark, huh, for you guys? Is that okay? All right. I might be really dark in the video. But okay, if it's okay, I'll keep it like this. Yes?
Predominant religion, do they worship Ahura Mazda?
Yes. Yes. The Parthians are still Zoroastrian, right? Zoroastrian. And we'll talk more about the Parthians later, but just know for now that this Seleucid Empire, which is so huge on paper, and it is huge, it stays huge for a long time, for several centuries, that whole eastern half, there's an area near, remember when we had those stupid thingies, and you had Sogdia and Bactria back here? Right next to them, slightly southwest, is Parthia. And it's out of Parthia that the Parthians come, and they're going to break away, and then they're going to conquer Sogdia and Bactria, and then they're going to start conquering more and more this way. Till finally, eventually, we'll see they conquer the whole, what used to be the Persian Empire, and they move into Mesopotamia, and it's going to be the Romans on this side, and the Parthians on this side, both massive geographically, both with just huge armies constantly clashing, neither able to conquer the other. And this is the great enemy of Rome, more than Carthage. Yeah?
How far did the Parthians get into India? Or do they go
Not really. The edges. Yeah. Past the mountains onto the plains, never. Yeah. There are some Greek, out of Bactria, some Greek elite lead expeditions into northwest India and actually establish kingdoms there for about 150 years. But they'll eventually be subsumed in larger native empires. So there's not much of a trace of them left. But there are actual, we call them Greek kingdoms in India, of all places, for a while. Yeah. So the Seleucids, like the Antigonids, highly centralized, as centralized as you can be in the ancient world over such geography. Very, very efficient tax system. They're investing their redistributed wealth in cities as well, and in trade expeditions and whatnot. Roads, it's a big thing, and you can see why, considering the geography. And then the third of the big ones, the Ptolemies in Egypt. The Ptolemies in Egypt. This is the longest lasting one. This is the most stable one. Rather than shrink over this period, the Ptolemy domain grows. I mean, we know the history of Egypt a little bit, so maybe that makes sense. Egypt would be the most stable throughout this period. And the Ptolemies also brutal centralizers. Their capital, Alexandria, which is the first city that Alexander straight up founded out of nothing. I mean, a fishing village was there. That's it. This is the greatest city of the Hellenistic age, by far. For centuries, this was the greatest city in the Mediterranean and in the Western world. Rome will come along and surpass it, but only in terms of population and as a power center. Alexandria still would have looked greater. Even with all of its monuments and everything, Rome could not match Alexandria in terms of just the grandeur before you. Rome will end up doubling the population of Alexandria. Alexandria at its height had like 500,000 people. So very large city. Okay, huge. Huge. There's some other great cities. Antioch, Seleucus, the Seleucid capital was great, 250,000 people. But Alexandria, that was the gleaming, the great cosmopolitan city of the age, the great encapsulation of what it meant to be living in the Hellenistic period. And we'll talk a little bit about Alexandria in just a second. So the Ptolemies also very good at expropriating. The poor Egyptian peasantry, they've been exploited by a central power for thousands of years. The Ptolemies are no different. They dump it all into Alexandria and a few other cities. They're also trying to expand their trade. The Ptolemies are leading trade expeditions way down all the way to Ethiopia, across North Africa, into Arabia. They're all over the place. But that rural farming class, they're paying for it all. Alexandria is the great city of the age. One of the wonders of the world at the time was Alexandria's lighthouse, called the Pharos. 300 feet tall. There's never been a building like this. 300 feet tall. It used you can see up there, it used polished mirrors to reflect the light of a bonfire that was always kept going, that you could see for miles and miles out to sea. It would have been incredible relative to everything else, any other structure of the time. Of course, what's the most, nowadays when we think of ancient Alexandria, what do we think of? The library, right? And the library was amazing. But the library was connected to another institution. Anyone know what that was? It was just one part of a bigger institution called the museum. The museum. The House of the Muses. So the Muses, these are female deities that provide inspiration. So the House of the Muses. And when we think of a museum, we think of like, you go into a place and there's all these things sitting there that you can look at. It's like a preservation place. There were museums like that in the Hellenistic era. You could go to. So I listed the three major states that come out of the Alexandrian Empire. There was a fourth that's much smaller. Think of it as northwest Anatolia. There was this fourth called Pergamum. Important, despite its size. Pergamum did have like a museum, like we think of it as a museum, a great museum, and a library. Second only to Alexandria's library. Same exact method, by the way. Pouring very efficient, the fruits of a very efficient tax system into these few things, so they become glorious. But Alexandria's library was way bigger. The library at the museum. Think of the museum in Alexandria as more of like the way we think of a university. That's probably more accurate. They called it the museum. We should think of it as a university. Or think of it at least as like a research library with some other stuff. I think of it as a university. So you have the library. And the library has, 700,000 rolls in it, scrolls and various documents, about the equivalent of 50 or 60,000 books. So actually nothing compared to like your average large university library, where there are millions of books. But for the ancient world, this is unbelievable. 50 or 60,000 books. And a lot of these books have been commissioned and produced for the library. They didn't exist before in this form. So one of the things that the Ptolemies tried to do, and this is happening across the Hellenistic world, there is a common Greek culture developing. Hellenistic culture. The Hellenes, the Greeks. The Greeks called themselves Hellenes or Hellenes. And if you want high government post, if you want to advance in this new order, you have to speak Greek. And ideally, you would have been educated in a Greek gymnasium. You would know Greek literature. You'd be able to make references to Homer. That's how you become part of this elite culture. And this is true from Persia all the way over to Macedonia, down to Egypt, and everywhere in between. There is an elite Greek culture, and it's very alluring. Often you'll see in history, you'll see barbarians come in, they'll conquer a civilization, and then they're the ones that disappear. Their culture is the one that disappears, right? 3-4 generations later. It's the civilized culture that takes over. But with the Greeks, they conquered, and their culture spread. It has great sticking power. We'll see when we talk about the Jews in a second. It doesn't get more impenetrable than the Jews. They're very unique, distinct. They're very big on maintaining their culture. And yet even the Jews will become Hellenized. Deeply so. I'll talk about it in a second. So every people, there's no people that's like immune to this. And of course, under the surface, out in the country or whatever, all the old traditions are still going, the old religions are still going, the old languages are still being spoken. But in the cities, in government, at an elite level, there's a common Greek culture, a Hellenistic culture everywhere. It's a new thing. And as a result, there's a demand for Greek language stuff. Everyone wants, the Greeks, they want access to the literature of this wider world that they've just discovered, but they want it in Greek. Meanwhile, you have all these elites from other cultures that are trying to be, they're Hellenized. They would like access to all the Greek works. And so you have libraries, and every city, to be a city, to be considered respectable, you have your gymnasiums, you have your theaters, you have all the Greek institutions, you have your libraries. Even Alexander, before he died, he's setting up libraries in every city he's founding. The purpose of which is to have Greek classics available for the locals to study, and to have local classics translated into Greek for the Greeks to study. So we talk about what was the purpose of Alexander's conquest. And some scholars have posited that he had these like utopian visions of a post-ethnic world or something. These are the things that feed into that. The fact that he's setting up these libraries, not just to indoctrinate the locals in all the great things about Greece, but to also teach the Greeks all the great things about local thought and philosophy and science. And it was a blend. It was a blend. So at Alexandria, for example, Ptolemy II, and you guys ever heard of this? That's right. The Greek translation of the Torah, the Hebrew Bible, essentially the Old Testament, right? This is a product of the Hellenistic age. Ptolemy II, as chief patron of the museum and its library, commissions, and the tradition states there were 70 scholars. That's where this name comes from. This is what the Romans will call this version. Now we all use it. But most, even Jews at this point, after a few generations of this, most Jews outside of Judea can't even read their own scriptures. They speak Greek. So they need a Greek edition of the Torah. And so that's one of the things that the library produces. 70 scholars supposedly got together. The story is they were all sitting in different rooms, not consulting each other, and they all came up with exactly the same translation, word for word. It is a miracle. 70, Septuagint, that's what that means, or 72 sometimes. But anyway, the point is, the library produces translations. It doesn't just collect. Whatever it goes out and gets, it then translates into Greek, so that everyone in this elite, all across this whole Hellenized world, now have access to it. And they make copies, and they're sent out. That's how you preserve things in the old world. You make copies and send it to another location, just in case of a fire or something, a conquest or whatever. So that's how, and this is important for Western history, because it's the Septuagint that most Jews will end up reading. And then later, most Christians will end up being Greek speakers, not from Judea. They'll be from somewhere else in this Hellenized world. They all speak Greek, and they use this. So when the Christians come along and it becomes a much bigger church, it breaks out of Judea and becomes a Greek-speaking church. Like everything else, Greek-speaking. This is what they use. These are scriptures they use. So this is really important. Yeah?
Were those 70 scholars that worked on, were they all Jewish, or were none of them Jewish?
I think they were Jewish. You'd have to look that up. But I believe they were Jewish scholars, yeah. But very important. And you see the same thing happening with thousands of other sacred or fundamental works from, as far away as India. You had scholars at the library in Alexandria in Africa studying and translating into Greek Sanskrit works from India. It was a pretty amazing blend. The idea was, let's gather all the wisdom of the world in this place, and then we'll make it available in our language, and we can progress from there. Yeah.
I remember reading one of the taxes to come into the harbor of Alexandria is you had to take all the reports that you had, they would make a copy, translate it, or you'd make a copy there so that they could keep it, give you back your originals. That was one of the taxes.
Interesting.
To be able to come into the port, so that no matter what it was, no matter how trivial it was, so that they could keep it.
Yeah, hey, that could totally be true. The idea that people are being taxed in works. If you bring in works into the vicinity of the library, they're going to take a look, they're going to make a copy. That would actually have taken a long time. It's not like while you're making your trade, we're going to quickly go copy your books. It's a huge project. Yeah, exactly. We have a scanner. But still, it's plausible. Yeah. But this museum had more than the library, had more than a museum. It had theaters that were dedicated just to poetry reading, theaters that were dedicated just to dramas. It had a giant area like a communal eating room, like a cafeteria, like you'd see at a university. It had living quarters for 1,000 scholars. There were 1,000 scholars at any given time just living there and working, patronized by the Ptolemaic state. What else did they have? Anyway, they had all sorts of stuff. So it's really more of a university. And it's interesting when you study like the scholars of this period, whether you're talking about mathematicians or astronomers or whoever, engineers, you look these guys up, they're being born all over the Hellenistic world. Greece, some Mediterranean island, who knows, North Africa somewhere. But they always end up dying in Alexandria. Because at some point, 80% of them moved to Alexandria. That's where the action is. That's where all the funding is. A lot of scholars haven't changed. That's where they go. So Alexandria, the great intellectual and otherwise gleaming capital of the Hellenistic world. And there's actually continuity between Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle and the museum. The first museum manager, the guy who founds it, was a student of Aristotle, Demetrius. And some of the managers in the line, as that continues, end up being insanely genius people, like real polymaths. We'll talk about some of them. I think the Hellenistic period is very much overlooked. That's my personal view. In a lot of textbooks, it gets like 3 pages. Then you're off to Rome. And obviously, you need to spend considerable time in Rome, but the Hellenistic world, in many ways, lays the foundation of our world, the modern world. And we'll talk about how that might be over the course of this session. And there are a lot of textbooks and scholars, they like to point out how there's no great original ideas during the Hellenistic period. That's hogwash. There's tons of innovation. There are just geniuses galore during this period. It's more ostentatious. Politically, there's less innovation. That's definitely true. We've got these highly centralized states. Think of them as police states. How much political innovation do you expect in a police state? Little. Maybe by the state, revolving around control. But you don't see much else. So we don't see much in like the sort of innovation we saw in Greece, for example, before all this, the political innovations. But in other fields, man, it's crazy. In fact, the innovations are so advanced, science progresses so far that some have wondered why the Industrial Revolution didn't break out in the 200s BC. And I'm going to ask you that question, so be thinking about that. Why didn't the Industrial Revolution, in other words, the Industrial Revolution was based on the innovations that led to extremely high efficiency, way higher efficiency, many levels of magnitude higher than what had existed before. So all of a sudden you could produce stuff for astronomically lower prices in astronomically lower amount of time. That's what the Industrial Revolution did. And as a result, stuff that used to be the purview of the rich and the elite suddenly became available to everyone because it's so much cheaper to produce. That's the great change of the Industrial Revolution. Why didn't that happen in the Hellenistic age? So have that in the back of your head. We'll see if you guys have some answers for that. So I'm going to go through some innovations And then at the end, let's have that discussion. In medicine, insane leaps into the future. Now, all of these advances, almost all of them, are going to be snuffed out eventually. And we'll talk about some of the forces that snuff them out eventually. But during the Hellenistic age, you see great advances in medicine. And we've talked already in this class about Greek medicine, right? What was the great innovation of Greek medicine? Right. The rational aspect, the divorcing of maladies from like spirits. The thing is, in Greece, there are still taboos about dead bodies. In Greece, you cannot handle a dead body. You certainly can't mutilate a dead body. And yet today, anyone studying medicine? Anyone taking an anatomy class? Do you guys work with cadavers?
Not yet.
Not yet, but you will.
Yes.
You will. Every university.
My girlfriend did? Yes.
Yes.
Many cadavers.
It's incredible.
We keep them all in the basement of the biology building.
Right. Here we are at a university. There are going to be cadavers here. And students will cut into them. It looks like turkey meat. That's part of your education. You sort of have to do it. But in Greece, there's a taboo against it, so it's not done. Well, now what happens when you take that Greek rational tradition and you move a bunch of Greek doctors to a place like Egypt? What do they do in Egypt when you die? Yeah, they're doing all sorts of stuff with your body. They're cutting it up, and they're slicing it, and they're pulling things out and pulling things through your nostrils, and it's crazy. But the taboos against mutilating or otherwise handling a dead body just are non-existent. And so these Greek doctors in Egypt, so it's a much more cosmopolitan world, a mixed world, you take that rational tradition, you combine it with the lack of taboos, and what you get is the first rational approach to dissecting a human cadaver that we know of. And the name here, you don't have to know all these names. These are just in case you're interested or you want to change your topic or who knows. Or if you do want to know the names, there it is. I mean, learn it. Herophilus is the big name in medicine during the Hellenistic age. Herophilus is like, okay, so he and his students are cutting up dead bodies. He is convinced this is the only way to learn about, to be able to make real breakthroughs. You've got to be able to cut in and see what's in there. And as far as we know, he's the first one to dissect an eye. He's the first one to study the intestines. And cut them up and look inside and try and figure it out. He's the first one to identify and properly say what they do, to identify ovaries. He's the first one to say that there is such a thing as a nervous system. He's the first one to say the brain is the center of that nervous system. I mean, can you imagine trying to diagnose things and not knowing about the nervous system? He's the first one. He's the first one to say, you know what the heart does? It pumps blood. I mean, you have to know that. You know that by cutting it open and testing things and pulling on things and taking notes, and that's what he does. He's able to come up, in fact, with a whole, because he's figured out what the heart is. It's not the liver, it's the heart. Because he's able to figure out what the heart does, he comes up with a whole science of diagnosing maladies, diagnosing sicknesses based on the pulse. He measures the pulse, and he's able to tell you what's wrong with you. Who knows if that totally works? He was convinced it worked. But this has lived on to the present. I told you before that you can go to the foothills of the Himalayas and they'll talk about Greek medicine. My wife and I lived in a hill station for about a year in the Himalayas called Darjeeling. It's a large Tibetan refugee population there. And they have doctors that they still call Greek doctors. They're Tibetans. But they call them Greek doctors. And this is still how they diagnose maladies. Remember, my wife got sick once, and we took her to this. I think back and I tell this story. I'm a little embarrassed, but we took her to this Greek doctor instead of what Westerners would consider a real doctor. We took her to a Greek doctor, Tibetan guy, and what did he do to figure out what was wrong with her? The first thing he did was measure her pulse. And that's really all he did. Once he'd measured her pulse and taken some notes, he said what was wrong with her, just based on that. And then he gave her these giant jawbreaker pills, and I'm not sure they did anything. But the point is, Greek medicine, based on Herophilus, and this whole science of pulse taking, it's still alive. Way over on the other side of Asia. So this is often what happens when you create a cosmopolitan environment. We know what we all know what cosmopolitan means. Cosmopolitan is like a lot of big cities are cosmopolitan because there's a mixing of cultures and peoples and ideas. Often when you live out in the country, depending on where you live, you might not have much cosmopolitan experience because you're not exposed to a lot of different ideas. Then you go into the big city and it's like there's people from this place and this place and this place and this place, and they all have different views and values, and it's a cosmopolitan experience. Yeah?
The difference between metropolitan and cosmopolitan.
Metropolitan just refers to a type of area, a city, an urban area, whereas cosmopolitan refers to a mixing and mingling of peoples, or at least exposure to many different peoples. And what is the Hellenistic age, if not the cosmopolitan age? You won't see a more cosmopolitan world than the Hellenistic world until the early modern period. It's very mixed. And even the Greeks, they're not like... They stop measuring what it means to be Greek in ethnic terms. To be Greek, to be a Hellene, means to imitate the Greeks. That's what it is. If you speak our language and you act like a Greek, you are a Greek. It's not if you share the same genetics. So, and that's how the Greeks thought. We know that. They literally wrote that down multiple times. Their attitude towards other peoples, even if you're Persian by birth, you can still be a Greek if you act Greek. So the elites across this world, this new Hellenized world, all act Greek. They dress Greek, they speak Greek, and they're familiar with Greek literature. The pillars right there. So that's what it means to be Greek. It's not an ethnic thing. At least it's not a biological thing. It's not even the Greeks themselves. They're the ones who made this. They don't consider themselves the only Greeks, not by a long shot. So anyone can be a Greek. And if you think about that, if the Greeks are sort of in charge everywhere, and you can be a Greek just by imitating the Greeks, that's going to be very tempting to a lot of people. You can see how Greek culture spreads very quickly among the elites of other... Now, there's plenty of pushback from local cultures, but it's very tempting for hundreds of thousands of people. In mathematics, this is the great age of Archimedes. There's so many mathematicians we could write here. Before him, Euclid is a Hellenistic guy. Eratosthenes is a Hellenistic guy. There's a lot of big... you could just keep naming these guys. Archimedes he's from Syracuse, maybe the greatest genius of the ancient world. We could put him in almost every category here. Genius. So many mathematical breakthroughs. He comes up with, as far as we know, the first highly accurate value of pi. Euclid, a few decades before him, writes the book on geometry. It's called the Elements of Geometry. It becomes a textbook that's used not for 50 years or 100 years or 500 years, 1,500 years. His textbook is the textbook on geometry. Now, if you know anything about textbooks, how long do they last before they're sort of... Yeah, that's right. That's right. There's a new edition every semester, and you must buy it. It's $80. Yeah, it's It's crazy. The shelf life of textbooks is so small. His textbook lasts 1,500 years. Yeah.
I worked at the campus store and somebody spent $1,200 in law books, and I feel like all of them were
Did you say spend 1,200?
$1,200 in law books.
That is crazy.
Yeah, I kind of want to describe what
That is crazy. Yeah, I purposefully try to make all my readings free because there's just so much available out there now that is free. I don't understand. I just don't understand why you'd make someone pay hundreds of dollars for a book when so much is free. Anyway, yeah, so Eratosthenes, this guy's measuring the shadows of, I mean, he was a polymath. He's almost at the level of Archimedes in terms of his genius. He was one of the head librarians, like the managers of the museum in Alexandria. But he estimates with remarkable accuracy the circumference of the earth. Columbus is going to come along almost 2,000 years later and do a way worse job. He's going to be thousands of miles off. This guy is a few miles off. Like, it's incredible. And you know how he did it? He measured, I'm terrible at math, so I'm not going to explain how he did this. You can figure this out. But somehow he used the shadows of tall buildings to extrapolate the circumference of the earth. Yeah.
He's also able to get the tilt of the earth, measure the tilt of the axis or something.
There you go. Yeah, and he did a lot of other things too. He was like a great musician, poet. I mean, crazy genius guy. But of course, nothing came out of the Hellenistic age. It's like just decadence. No. Genius after genius. In engineering, you see new feats of engineering, things you've never seen before. And again, why not an industrial revolution now? We could put Archimedes over here too. Like I said, he could be everywhere. Ctesibius is using steam power. Steam power. Yeah, he's created steam-powered puppets. He's created steam-powered, like he comes up with a water pump. He comes up with a water clock that's super accurate. He comes up with a steam-powered organ. All sorts of things. The problem is, the stuff he's coming up with, though, if applied in other spheres, we could have had an industrial revolution in the 200s BC. However, most of his stuff is being applied for the entertainment of the court. They called them wonderworks. We'll see this same thing. There will be, like in the 19th century, there will be a fascination, once again, on like mechanical wonderworks. But they could have gone back 2,000 years and found these same things being, on display in the court of the Ptolemies. You don't see them generally applied for practical purposes. So they had steam power, and they were applying it across the board for entertainment purposes, but it just wasn't being applied for practical purposes. Now, that's not to say they weren't practical engineering. I mean, Archimedes created the largest ship that we know of up to this time in Syracuse, the Titanic of his day, but it didn't sink. I'm trying to remember the name of it. It's like the Syracusian or something like that. You'll have to look that up. Incredible vessel. Dwarfed anything on the Mediterranean at the time. And as he's inventing this ship, as he's putting it together, he's inventing all sorts of practical things for ships. One of the things he invents is called Archimedes' screw, or the water snail. I don't know if any of you guys know this. If you think of like a screw, you think of that coil thing around the screw. So he invents that. And one of the things that can do, I mean, there's so many applications for it, as I'm sure you know. But one of the things the reason he invents it is it's a way to get water off of a ship. If you manually turn it, you know how it gives you the impression of going up? Yeah, you create that in a cup-like shape. That can actually lift the water up. You just turn it, and the water gets lifted out. This was applied, he thought of this while he was in Egypt. He's like, I can apply this to irrigation. Egypt, land scarcity is a big problem because you got the Nile and then what? Desert everywhere. So if you can extend that irrigation out, even where the land is going up in elevation, you can greatly extend your farming base, which the Ptolemies, they're really interested in this, because the more farming there is, the more taxation is possible. So they're all good with this, and Archimedes comes up with an application for irrigation that allows irrigation to go out even where the elevation is going up, because he can lift the water up. And this is still used today. And there's like 100 other applications of the Archimedes screw. But anyway, all this stuff is invented during this Hellenistic age. The biggest catapults ever, the biggest siege towers ever. Of course, where these states, all states are interested, big states are interested in powerful militaries. So there is an incentive there to apply this new stuff. So you see some military innovation. We've got in terms of stuff, tech, the most technologically advanced militaries so far in human history. Yeah?
Around this time there was also this technology called the antikythera mechanism.
Okay.
They consider the first analog computer.
Really?
Where 37 gears, you would use your hand as like this nozzle. It would track the motion of the sun and the moon.
Huh. Was that its purpose, to track the sun?
Yeah, I guess it was also used in the Olympic Games too. But
Really?
I think
The first analog computer
it died out
type.
probably around 60 BC.
Huh. Yeah, see, we like to think of the Romans as the next step in advancement of Western civilization. In some ways, I guess they were, particularly military. Maybe legal if you consider a giant, huge empire and a step forward. But in other ways, the Romans really snuffed out a lot. They destroyed a lot. The Romans are one reason that this didn't keep going. And we'll talk about some of the other reasons as well. You see all sorts of stuff. Gadgets, gizmos. The big name in astronomy is Aristarchus. No innovative original ideas during the Hellenistic period, except Aristarchus, who says, hey, we live in a heliocentric universe. The sun is at the center. We're all revolving around the sun. And this is rejected by a lot of people, and eventually it'll be rejected by almost everyone. But he says, not only are we at the center, but he accurately, very accurately is able to estimate the distances between the Earth and or between the sun and the various planets in the correct order. And he points to the stars and says, those lights, I think those are other suns. I mean, this is breakthrough stuff. This is going to be considered a huge breakthrough in the 1500s AD when Copernicus does it. And he's doing it 1800 years before Copernicus. Eventually, Aristarchus' idea, his model, will be rejected because people will try and track the movement of heavenly bodies using his model, and it won't quite work. So they'll go back to what they're used to. This is the same problem that Copernicus had, by the way. Both Aristarchus and Copernicus theorized perfect circular orbits, when the reality, as Johannes Kepler will show later, is that we're talking elliptical orbits. Then, as soon as you introduce ellipses, it gets super accurate, and you sort of have to throw away the old models. Unfortunately, Aristarchus did not come up with ellipses. But still, heliocentric, the planets in order, proper distances, stars are suns. I mean, this is breakthrough stuff that much of the world will forget. And the Western world will completely forget for many, many centuries. We'll talk about the avenues of preservation of this stuff later. I'll touch a little bit more on it today, and then we'll talk about it later. But essentially, just so you know, the Irish will preserve a lot of this stuff. The Arabs, will find a lot. They'll in their new domain when they do 600s, 700s AD, when they create a vast empire, they find themselves now the possessors of a lot of this literature, which they translate into Arabic, and their own philosophers will study, and in that way preserve. And then, of course, there's, and this is the one I'll talk about a little bit today, there's the eastern half of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, that never falls. We concentrate so much on the West and the fall of Rome. The whole eastern, much richer, much more populated half, with the actual Roman capital at the time, is still there. And it will still be there for 1,000 years after the fall of Rome. And it of course, is preserving much of this. So, there are these various avenues of preservation through which all this Hellenistic advancement will be preserved, or much of it will be preserved. Again, people point to the Hellenistic age and act like there were no original ideas, but there were. Some of the great isms of the next 500 years, even 1,000 years, come out of the Hellenistic age. Yeah, cynicism is considered sort of the beginning, the original idea that will then spawn the two big ones for the Hellenistic age, Stoicism and Epicureanism, which I'll talk about in a minute. But it starts with cynicism. Cynicism is sort of a weird thing, but think of it as a reaction to the materialism of the age. So here we're seeing, like I said, 300 new cities pop up. And the cities that are there, these new capitals, they're gleaming, they're huge, monumental structures. We have a new, resplendent elite. The ruling classes in all of these states, think what's the traditional Greek value when it comes to wealth? You remember? What's that? Moderation, yeah, you spend it on public things. If you are seen to be living in luxury, that's considered decadent, and it's considered corrupting to the soul. You don't do that. But as we saw even just with Alexander, the new Greek way, at least in these states, is to live in luxury. So this is an example of the Greeks adopting foreign ways. In Egypt, in what was Persia especially, the way that rulers are treated, the lifestyle they're used to is super glamorous. And it's filled with luxury, kowtowing, and what the Greeks would have considered total and utter decadence. And so you have groups like the Cynics popping up as a response to this, saying we live in a totally decadent, materialistic age, and what we need to do is simplify. We need to simplify and go back to being natural. This is unnatural. This is so jumbled, I'm sorry. This is the big name in cynicism, is Diogenes. Diogenes is this exile living in Athens, and he lives in rags. He's essentially a homeless guy on purpose. He lives in rags. He sleeps, everyone always says he sleeps in a tub. He actually sleeps in, remember those, I talked about the Minoan jars that were huge? He sleeps in a big giant Mediterranean jar turned on its side on the street. And he does that, yeah, you can see how that might be comfortable. He does that to illustrate the point. He considers himself very happy, very content. It's like, I don't need a bunch of stuff. In fact, your stuff is making you unhappy. The Cynics were all about going back to what was natural. That word cynic comes from a Greek word for dog-like. Dog-like. The Cynics, people like Diogenes, were considered like dogs, sleeping on the street and doing whatever dogs do on the street. What do you see dogs do on the street? Defecate. Right, the Cynics would defecate in public. Their point being, you might have all your conventions and institutions and your luxuries, but we're animals. And this is what animals do. And so they would defecate in the street. They would fornicate in the street. You also see dogs do that. And so, obviously, this is an extreme reaction. relative to everyone else. This is an extreme reaction to the decadence of the Hellenistic age, but there's a reaction. And out of this reaction is born a couple other really important isms of the Hellenistic age. Important because they will be adopted, studied, debated for centuries and centuries after this, throughout the whole Roman period. Many Romans are going to end up being Epicureans or especially Stoics. So these are ideas that will have staying power for, 800-900 years. Yeah?
How do records of Diogenes survive? What records are there about?
Yeah, we have the records of people who are describing Athens or who came across him in Athens. And cynicism becomes enough of a movement that people are recording it. And Diogenes is sort of considered its founder, so he gets attention. Yeah. So Stoicism, and tell me why you think so many Romans would find this appealing. Stoicism, one of the things that, and a lot of this comes from Greek tradition. To the Greeks, fate is a big thing, right? Fate. And we already talked about how in Greek tragedies and other Greek writings, that dichotomy between fate and free will is such a thing. It's a central theme, right? And so this is, because now we live in a Hellenized world, this idea is going to spread all over the Hellenistic world. We'll see it, it'll infiltrate even Jewish thought. It'll be something that early Christians have to deal with. And it will change their original ideas as well. So these Greek ideas, this is really important for laying the foundations of future Western civilization. And the fact that this Hellenistic world existed, this is what makes this is why it's important. Otherwise, it's self-contained there in Greece. Well, now it's not. All these Greek ideas we've been discussing are now prevalent all across and all the way over to Spain and the northwest tip of North Africa. This is all one big, great Hellenized world. And the Romans will spread it even further. So, free will and fate. Are they both real? Is only one real? If one's real, does the other matter? These are things people talk about. So the Stoics did believe in fate. There is fate, and you can't escape it. However, they also believed free will mattered. Motivations matter. But since fate is real, and since you can't control it or escape it, you may as well accept it. You want happiness in the world? Accept the fate that is laid out for you. The only thing you can control sometimes is your reaction to whatever comes. And so, there's the famous example of the Stoic who was told that his child had died. And instead of weeping and wailing, he took it calmly. Internally, he's struggling, but externally, he's tranquil. And he says, well, I knew that I didn't sire an immortal. And that's his response. So the Stoics are all about calmness, tranquility, endurance, taking on whatever fate presents with strength and courage. They believed in absolute principles of justice in particular. There's a Stoic phrase that every Stoic would have known, everyone would have known. And that is, the whole world is one city, one constitution, and one law. The whole world is one city. The idea being, there is one underlying truth for everybody. Truth doesn't suddenly change just because you shift cultures. The whole world is one city. And if the whole world is one city, then we are all brothers and sisters. And if we're all brothers and sisters, then we each have a duty to do what we can to help each other. And you can see how this is a Greek idea. Their concept of helping each other was especially political. That means you take part in politics. You have a duty to your brothers and sisters to take part in politics. So Stoics are known as they have great endurance, sometimes stone-faced when other people are showing extremes of passion or anger. These guys shun extremes of passion or anger. They shun emotional extremes. They said that the Stoics feel that the best life is the philosopher's life, the life of contemplation. So that's Stoicism. And this is going to be important because leading Romans will adopt Stoicism, even a couple emperors. Yeah?
So Stoicism is like the modern day, everything happens for a reason kind of thing?
Maybe. With less of an emphasis on emotionalism. In fact, an emphasis on limiting significantly emotionalism. Yeah?
Would it be more like that's just how life is?
Yeah. So that, and cultivating that to the extent that even if you were faced with, theoretically, even if you were faced with a great tragedy, you could handle it. You would maintain that tranquility. You'd train yourself to maintain that tranquility so that what might break other people only strengthens you, sort of a thing. Yeah? They definitely, yes, they had their value system. They had their morality. Like I said, the great moral element in Stoicism was that of justice. So they did believe there's a right and a wrong, and your duty to your fellow man is to pursue justice. Make sure the right is, it prevails. But then again, if you fail, that's your fate. Don't let it ruin your life or ruin your day. You soldier on. Yeah. So the great name, again, just in case you're interested, for Stoics was Zeno, sort of the founder of Stoicism, if you want to look him up. Epicureanism also comes out of Cynicism. This is the other great ism of the Hellenistic age that will make its way into the Roman period as well. Quite popular. And it's very different than Stoicism. There's some similarities, but for the most part, it's quite different. So Epicurus, he looked around and he said, there's a lot of people striving to do this or that. There's a lot of people striving to seek justice in politics or whatever. But at the end of the day, so a lot of these peoples are followers of a guy named Democritus, who posited that the whole world is made up of, it doesn't matter what you're talking about, what material thing, it could be human beings or a stone. If you go down to as small an element as possible, you get to these things called atoms. He came up with that word, atom. And so we're all just atoms anyway. So there's a little bit of maybe a nihilism there, but Epicurus said, look, people worry and stress so much about this or that pursuit or this or that thing, and he often would use politics as an example. He said, ultimately, this stuff is meaningless. And so a lot of these people, they spend their whole lives and all their energy doing this thing, and then they suddenly turn around and they're an old person. And they realize, what have I done with my life? I didn't actually do any of the things that I thought I would do. No utopia emerged. And now I'm old. He said, that's just not the way to live. So, very much unlike the Stoics, and very much unlike Greek tradition, Epicurus said, live in hiding. That was his phrase, live in hiding. Live in hiding, be calm, avoid stress. So that don't worry, be happy idea is very Epicurean. If it's stressful, why are you doing it? He said, spend time with good friends and good company. If you want to be intellectual and pursue the philosopher's life, do that. But enjoy yourself. Have fun. Because at the end of the day, all these other things that people go crazy about, they're meaningless. It's meaningless. Enjoy yourself. He was very much about hanging out with people you enjoy hanging out with. And so that's how you should spend your time. And he had a study group. So that very much, you can see how that breaks with Greek tradition, like hugely. Greek tradition, one of the great Greek values is a civic duty to be part of the politics of the polis. He's saying, forget that. That's stressful and pointless, especially now. And so he had a study group. He broke with Greek tradition in that he allowed women into his study group. He allowed slaves into his study group. So he's innovating all over the place. But there's no great innovative thinkers of the Hellenistic period, just so you know. So that's Epicureanism. A lot of people have compared it to, they've claimed that it's sort of a great-great-grandfather movement to modern libertarianism. I don't know if I buy that, but some people say that. And then I want to mention one more ism, philosophical ism of the time. It's a great illustration of the cross-pollinization, cross-fertilization of peoples and ideas that is characteristic of the Hellenistic age, and that is skepticism. Skepticism. And the name here is Pyrrho. Again, you don't have to know all these names, okay? That's just for your information. Pyrrho was one of Alexander's men. So he made it all the way to India. And while in India, he came across this new thing, ascetics. Do you guys know what asceticism is? Anyone want to try and define that for me? Asceticism? An ascetic is a person that seeks to deny themselves of material things, often to an extreme level. Like they'll go out and live on a mountaintop or in a desert or in the jungle and meditate or pray or something, often for years or decades. You know, in the Hindu tradition, you're supposed to spend the last quarter of your life as an ascetic, meditating out in the wilderness. So while he's in India, he comes across these ascetics. And you can still see ascetics in India today. When you go to India, you can see men dressed basically in loincloths. They might beg for food, but otherwise it's purposeful. They're denying themselves in order to discover real truth. Pyrrho is impressed by these guys, and particularly he's impressed by their idea that that relying on the senses to gain truth is faulty thinking. The senses lie to you all the time. This is what supposedly these ascetics taught him. So, for example, our senses are telling us we're here, you guys are sitting still right now. But what do you actually know? Are you sitting still? I mean, you sort of are, depending on, relative to... It's a frame of reference. Right. Actually, you're spinning through space at thousands of miles an hour. You're not still, but your senses are telling you you're still. So these ascetics would say your senses lie to you all the time, or they give you contradicting information. So if that's true, you can't know anything. And this is what the skeptics taught. You can't know anything because everything you know is sensory, is based on the senses. And so he would have pointed to Epicurus or Zeno or Diogenes and said, you guys might have good ideas, but they're your ideas. It's just ideas. It's either based on your opinion or it's based on your senses, either of which could be wrong. So the skeptics, and again, this is sort of a reaction to the age, this very cosmopolitan age, this clashing of ideas and whatnot. They'd say, look, what you want to do is cultivate tranquility because you can't actually know anything. So instead, just for peace of mind, go along with the traditions of your community, knowing all along that you actually can't know anything. Yeah?
Would you say that movement is kind of like a philosophical movement?
A philosophical movement?
Yeah.
Yes, because it has to do with the nature of knowledge, which is sort of what philosophy revolves around. And you'll notice that a lot of these are all ethics. This is ethics. This is the Socrates legacy. Ethics. These all focus on how to live and what's going to bring you happiness, the most happiness. Ethics. Yeah.
Do you think Descartes said his your senses lie to you, but we know that your mind or influenced by these guys?
Can you say the beginning of that again?
Yeah, so Descartes' theories are all about how your senses and perceptions
Right.
but in your mind it's true.
Right.
Do you think he was influenced by these guys?
Possibly. He was well read. He would have studied these guys. It was very much trendy at the time to study these guys. But at the end of the day, the skeptics would have said you can't know anything. That doesn't mean you reject everything. It just means for peace of mind's sake, realize your limitations. You can go along with various traditions, but realize your limitations. So there's all sorts of, you can see how a lot of this is a response to the age. I'm going to save the Jews for next time. Instead, I want to have I have about 10 minutes, right? Yep. Discussion. Look at this, people. A timer. Huh? Yeah. That's not happening again. I want you to turn to your neighbor, and I want you to tell me what this graphic means. Figure it out. Go. You have 2 minutes. Okay, maybe not 2 minutes. What do you guys think? Who wants to decode this for me? It is a bridge. Go home. You guys are good. What do you think?
Oh.
Yeah.
So the Greeks recaptured the magic of the ancient Egyptians, which was kind of lost in Mesopotamia. Hence the up and then the down.
Oh, wow. The up, the down, the up. Never even thought of that. Excellent. Okay. The Greeks recaptured the magic of the Egyptians that had sort of been lost by the Mesopotamians. Anyone else want to decode a little piece of this or all of it? Yeah.
Okay, I originally thought that it was that the Hellenistic world is like the bridge of the Hellenistic world is kind of like to the modern world, and that Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Greece are like one section of the bridge.
Okay. This does represent a bridge between the ancient world and the modern world. Good. Yeah.
I feel like it just represents like how so much of what we like learned from these three like dynasties or like kingdoms, like we see today still in like the modern period.
Okay.
Like, we're still experiencing stuff like using technologies that we were first. Yeah.
Definitely still civilizational threads, that date back to there.
The modern period has no connection to the Hellenistic world directly, but there's like all these peoples in between here and there that have like brought the ideas and the sort of cultural elements from the Hellenistic world to the modern period.
Great. Yeah, the bridge isn't actually connecting the two, is it? But it is there between the two. It's an indirect connection. I know it's an imperfect thing. It's a graphic, people. Anyone have anything else, or should I just decode this thing a little bit? Yes?
I was thinking that the largest portion is Mesopotamia affected everything, so a lot of Egyptian culture came out of that. Greek culture.
Right. And we could throw up Persia up there, too. I left that off. We should put that there. Anatolia we could put there. Yes?
I think it brings us back to like why it took the individual who did the circumference of the world, why it didn't appear again to like 1500 AD.
Right.
Because the police states and they inspired little innovation.
Good. So the Hellenistic era was a bridge. It's a bridge. If you think of it the Hellenistic era, this is the first time in ancient history in this entire huge region. We're talking about from Europe and North Africa over to Central Asia. This is the first time that that whole region has been connected by a common elite culture, the Hellenistic culture. And so there's a huge there's an amalgamation taking place here, cross-fertilization. And it just so happens that at that moment, there's a collection effort going on. Libraries everywhere, and this is a Greek thing. Libraries everywhere, including the Library at Alexandria. Books being translated, copied, scattered. So in other words, that whole entire milieu, including Egypt and Mesopotamia and a lot of the civilizational centers that we've studied, this is all being documented. Much of what we think we know about Mesopotamia or about Egypt or about Persia actually comes from what people during this period wrote about. Like we're using their secondary sources. We don't have the primary sources, but we have their sources or their copies or their commentaries on some older source that we don't have anymore, but thank goodness we have the Hellenistic era source. As I said, and we'll talk about some of the things that end up snuffing all this out, eventually this world is going to shrink. This Hellenistic world is going to shrink as new conquests happen, as Rome happens. However, a lot of these works will end up being, and we'll talk about this later, end up being preserved in monasteries in the far western fringes of Europe. Other works will be found by the Arabs, translated and preserved that way. But most of these works will be preserved in the eastern half of the Roman Empire, which lasts till 1453. Now you should remember that year. I'm not much about years, but if there's one year you could learn in all of world history, you could make a good argument for 1453, the year the Ottoman Turks took over Constantinople. And the fall of the Byzantine Empire, or the Eastern Roman Empire, was made complete. That was 1453. And in the decades leading up to that, you have refugees and scholars fleeing the Eastern Roman Empire, fleeing Constantinople, as the Turks take more and more and more. They're fleeing, and where they're fleeing? They're fleeing to Italy. The Italian city-states at that point are the great middlemen between Europe and Asia. So they're fleeing to the people they know, Italy. And in Italy, people suddenly gain an appetite for ancient Greek documents and ancient Latin documents. And we call this the Renaissance, the rebirth of all this knowledge. And it sparks all sorts of things: the Reformation, the Scientific Revolution, the Agricultural Revolution, the Industrial Revolution, the Enlightenment, the modern world. The great bridge between the ancient world and the modern world was all this Hellenistic knowledge and this Hellenistic collection effort that made its way circuitously back to Europe via the Byzantine Empire and Italy. So this really is the bridge. This is the bridge between ancient and modern. I don't know what our world would look like if this vast, centuries-long effort hadn't taken place. We'll talk more about it next time. If you have any questions, come talk to me.
We hope you enjoyed that lecture, found it interesting. If you have any questions on that topic or any historical topic, or even other topics.
Yeah, so we've got a history expert here. But if you have other questions, maybe related to learning, say you've got a younger learner and you're wondering, how do we make an 80-minute college lecture accessible? Well, put a question in the chat. I'll see what I can come up with.
Right. So if you're Nomad Nation, you have access to a Q&A. Head over to the Q&A, input your question there. We check that regularly, and hopefully you find that helpful. And now, on to the answers regarding where I filmed those mini lectures. Let's do it.
All right, let's reveal the locations of the next 4 mini lectures. Here we go. At number 1, you can see we're in a tropical zone. I am in Ecuador. And I filmed a few in Ecuador before. The topic this time will be Gran Colombia. Number 2, a lot of clues in this one. I am in Texas at the Johnson Space Center, NASA's facility there. We'll be talking about the space race. And then here in number 3, I filmed in Japan many times before. The topic this time will be Kyoto as imperial capital. And then number 4 here, again in Texas, this time in front of the George W. Bush Presidential Library, and we'll be talking about the global war on terrorism. I hope those sound interesting and engaging. Tune into my YouTube channel, The Nomadic Professor, every Saturday for the finished product.
All right, so I hope you look forward to seeing these lectures published from these great locations around the world. Last note, if you are taking part in our courses, just to let you know, we will have a full unit of our second US course, The Noise of Democracy, out before our next webinar in January. That'll include 5 sessions, including a document lesson, all the other parts of these sessions that you're used to seeing.
Audio, video, text, all the scaffolding, notes, everything.
Right, so that'll be out before our next webinar in January. So pay attention in Nomad Nation to the date and time and link for the next webinar, and we'll see you then.